Hello, and welcome to Class 9 on Arguments by Analogy. Analogies are used for all sorts of purposes. A lot of the times, analogies are just used to illustrate. They make our language more interesting, they drive points home emotionally. But sometimes analogies are used to make an argument, and that's what we want to focus on here. So this first segment will be about distinguishing arguments by analogy from other uses of analogy. At this point, you should have done the reading and the exercises. So here I'm just going to review the ideas from the reading and go over some of the exercise answers. If you didn't understand the reading the first time through, you can also just watch the first part of this video, then try the exercises, then look at my sample answers. You can also do that if you just prefer to take in information by video rather than reading. So after that section of reading exercises video, there's a section of Class 9 that goes on to discuss how analogies works and gives you the argument scheme for arguments by analogy. That also has a reading, an exercise, and a video. So the idea of an analogy is straightforward enough. An analogy is just a statement that two things are similar in some respects. We've called the two things being compared analogs. Notice that since this is a single statement and it can't be an argument yet. As a single statement, it can have many uses. We're going to look at some of those uses and then look specifically at situations where these statements occur as premises in arguments. So here's an example of an analogy that is just a single statement. A prime minister is like a president. So it has two sides, which we're calling analogs. On the one hand, the prime minister, on the other hand, the president. This our analogy actually doesn't specify any similarities, just leaving that to the listener to fill in. But we can imagine some, right? Both prime ministers and presidents run the executive branch of the government. Both are elected. The chief difference is that prime ministers are elected by the parliament, where presidents are elected directly by the people. Okay, so an argument by analogy is bigger than a single statement like that. It is an argument from it is an inductive argument that starts from the premise that since things are similar in some it is an inductive argument that starts from the premise that some things are similar in some ways. And from this infers the conclusion that they are similar in other ways. So here's a common argument, and it's basically a summary of a very standard scientific argument. Rats are biologically similar to humans. That's the analogy. In that both are mammals and have similar tumor suppressing genes. There we're specifying the similarities. Saccharin causes cancer in rats, therefore saccharin is likely to cause cancer in humans too. So that's straightforward enough. This is different than simply having an argument, having an analogy used to illustrate something. So, for instance, here's an analogy used to illustrate. Doctor, my headache feels like a hammer banging on the inside of my skull, right? So here we just have one statement. It's used to have an emotional impact it might help the doctor diagnose the kind of headache. But basically, there's only one similarity and there's no argument present. There are no premises, there are no conclusions, right? What makes the argument about saccharin, an argument, is that it has a premise and a conclusion. It actually has several premises and a conclusion, right? When I was defining it, I mentioned that an argument by analogy is an inductive argument. Here, let me skip ahead to that slide. Arguments are inductive if they aim at validity. Arguments are inductive if they aim at strength, and they are deductive if they aim at validity. So, validity is a property of the inference from the premises to the conclusion. And an argument is valid if its inference is as strong as it can it is the best it could possibly be. A valid inference is a perfect inference. And in the European tradition of logic, since medieval times, the paradigm of a valid argument has been Socrates is all people are mortal. Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? It is universally valid. You can't deny it. Most of the time, as I said in the previous class, arguments aren't valid. They are merely strong. And we say that an argument is strong if the premises, were they true, would make the conclusion likely to be true. Strong is a property of inferences. Inferences are strong if they are good enough. So, inductive arguments are arguments that are just trying to be strong. We're just, the inference is just supposed to be good enough. Arguments by analogy are always inductive. They can never have perfect deductive validity. You're always just doing the best you can. Things are similar, so they might be in some ways, so they might be similar in other ways. Okay, so here's the argument about rats in standard form. And actually here I've broken it down into two premises and a conclusion. Rats are biologically similar to humans in that both are mammals and have similar tumor-suppressing genes. Saccharin causes cancer in rats. Conclusion, saccharin causes cancer in humans. You can actually break down this farther and have the two similarities that are mentioned in the first premise be separate premises. But actually, we're going to keep them lumped together this way so that we can apply our argumentation scheme to it. Okay, so that's the basic idea of an argument by analogy and other uses of analogy. Again, it's an argument if there's a premise and a conclusion. It is it's another use of analogy, for instance, just to illustrate, if it's a single sentence that's mostly just having an emotional impact. Okay, so now let's take a look at some exercises. So for the first set of exercises, you need to determine whether the passage contains an argument by analogy or an analogy used for some other purpose, like a literary analogy. If the analogy is an argument, you have to write it in standard form, and if it's not, you just have to identify the two analogs. So essentially, you have to decide which of our examples is the passage most like. Is it like our example of an argument by analogy, which is here, the argument that saccharin is likely to cause cancer in humans? Or is it like our example of an analogy used to illustrate, where the patient just says, "Doctor, my headache feels like a hammer banging on the inside of my skull"? Also, if we go back to the reading, we've got a couple examples we can talk about there. In the reading, the example of a literary analogy or an analogy used to illustrate is just Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Should go back and look at that. And the argument, the example of an argument by analogy was this argument about buying a car. So we've got these examples, and we want to see which one the thing we're looking at is most like. So here we go. Example 1. Question 1. Country is like a ship with the president as its captain. Just as a captain should be obeyed without question during a storm, the president should be given special powers in periods of crisis. Notice the first sentence gives us our comparison. The second sentence actually looks like it's pressing a conclusion on us. It wants us to think that because the first half of the sentence is true, the second half of the sentence is also true. So this looks like it's an argument by analogy, not just an analogy used to illustrate. It's not just like Shakespeare. It's not just like Doctor. It feels like a hammer banging on my head. It feels like you're trying to be convinced of something. So we can put it in standard form like this. So here is the argument. P1, a country with a president is like a ship with a captain. P2, the captain should be obeyed without question during a storm. Conclusion, the president should be given special powers in a time of crisis. Next up, an analogy is like a rented tuxedo. It never quite fits. I mean, we've got a comparison here. The analogies are like tuxedos. We've got one similarity. They don't fit. There's nothing we're really trying to be convinced of here. I mean, we might fill something in saying, oh, you shouldn't use argument by analogies, but that's not really what it says. That would be adding too much to it. So really, we want to say that this is not an argument. It's an analogy used to illustrate. In fact, it's really just a pun, right? It's a pun on the word fits. A rented tuxedo literally doesn't fit, while an analogy only doesn't fit figuratively. All right, now look at this one. The finances of a government are like the finances of a family. Family can't go on spending more than it takes in. So we've got a comparison, and then we've got a statement about one side of the comparison, the family. Seems really implicit, really, they're strongly implying that the same is going to apply for the government. Government shouldn't run deficit spending. So we can fill that in because it seems like the speaker wants us to think that. And therefore, this is an argument by analogy, and we can fill in the standard form. Standard form would look like this. The finance, P1, the finances of the government are like the finances of a family. P2, a family can't go on spending more than it takes in. And then we have a conclusion that was only implicit before. The government can't go on spending more than it takes in. Okay, 4. The vice president is like the spare tire on the automobile of government. So, vice president takes over when the president is incapacitated, and spare tires are used when tires go flat. You've got a comparison with one similarity. But one of the things that I said was that comparisons with only one similarity don't really aren't enough to create an argument by analogy. So again, number 4 is an analogy used to illustrate. It's not an argument. Because there's really only one similarity. And another way of thinking about it is it's also like the rented tuxedo thing. It's kind of a joke, maybe. At the very least, it's a distant analogy. So it's not really compelling in any way besides emotionally. The human mind is like a computer. It slows down when it has to confront too many alternatives. So there's a lot you can say about the relationship between the human mind and a computer. People dedicate entire academic careers to this. But all that's being mentioned here is one similarity, that they both slow down in certain circumstances. And that, again, doesn't seem to be enough to me to sustain an argument. So I would say that this is an analogy used to illustrate and not an argument. You could fill in other similarities to use between computers and minds, but I don't see how that really would help you convince anyone of the fact that they both slow down when confronted with too many alternatives, or really how any of them are really relevant here. So I'm going with our analogy used to illustrate. Okay, finally, spending a great deal of money to provide medical care for the aged is like wasting money on a car. When the car is all worn out, needs a new engine, transmission, and bodywork, it's better just to junk it. The same goes for people. You can feel the argument here, right? I mean, you got a similarity being a property being attributed to one side, and then the person is saying the same goes for people. The same way earlier, we said, oh, well, the finances are similar, and this is true of the family. The same goes for government. So we can begin to fill this in as a full argument by analogy. And it winds up looking like this. Old people are like old cars, P1. P2, when an old car is worn out, it's easier to junk it than to pay for repairs. Conclusion, when people get old, it's easier to euthanize them than pay for repairs. And actually what's happening here, and I didn't come up with this example, this is from another critical thinking textbook, but when you actually spell out the full analogy, I think it kind of becomes clear that the person is saying something kind of nasty. I mean, talking about old people like they're just junk cars. So actually one advantage of the thing that we're doing in this section, analyzing arguments by analogy and taking apart all their pieces, is that they can often bring out hidden assumptions that people are making that they wouldn't want to say explicitly. Okay, so that's it for the exercises. Next up, we're going to talk about the parts of an argument by analogy.